Okay, we might get started. So thank you all for attending this webinar on the gender impacts of COVID-19. I would just like to introduce our guest speaker, Bridget Tehan. Bridget has worked for more than 10 years in emergency management in both the government and non-for-profit sectors. She currently works at the Victorian Council of Social Service to highlight the needs of people who are may be vulnerable and disadvantaged in emergencies, and to highlight the role of community and social service organisations before, during and after emergency events. Bridget is also the co-founder and president of the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network. We will have an opportunity at the end for questions, so if you can please send these through the question box, that would be wonderful. And I would now like to welcome Bridget to start the presentation. Thanks so much, Bridget.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Samantha, and thank you for the invitation, and to everybody attending today, taking times out of your busy and rather complex lives to log into this webinar and have a listen to what we've got to say. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country upon which we are all variously seated, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Just a little bit to start off with about the Victorian Council of Social Service. So for those of you that don't know, we are the peak body for the community and social service sector in Victoria. There are councils for social service in every state and territory in Australia, as well as the Australian Council of Social Service, which is the peak body for national organisations and also for each of the councils of social service. As Samantha said, we have a number of years of experience in emergency management, which has come in quite handy at the moment, as you can imagine, with this incredibly widespread and broad impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So drawing on research and experience, some of the things that we do know is that disasters and emergencies are profoundly discriminatory. People who are socially vulnerable are more likely to die and less likely to recover. And while they impact everybody equally, so a cyclone, a hurricane, a flood, a bushfire has the same impact on everybody, the effects are enormously different. And why that is, I'll just give you a few examples. People living in poverty can't afford insurance. So they're behind the eight ball from the very outset, from when an emergency hits right through for the rest of their lives as an impact and even an intergenerational impact. Emergency evacuation planning isn't tailored to meet the needs of people with a disability. Older people with limited mobility can't clear out their gutters or prepare their properties for an impending disaster. Children's lack of agency means that they're particularly vulnerable to decisions made by their parents, caregivers, or even emergency services at the height of an emergency. And emergency communications are not often in languages or in forms that are accessible to all community members, and particularly those from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, as you all know. We also explore, I guess, the role of community and social service organisations in emergencies. And what we like to do is to really highlight the critical role that they can play in being a conduit to those vulnerable members of the community, or some of those members of the community that I just touched on earlier. So if you're an emergency service thinking about doing planning for people with a disability, instead of knocking on a door and asking every person with a disability what they might need and how they might work with that emergency service agency, go to your local disability service provider and have a chat with them. Not only do they have the skills and experience in working with people with a disability, they have assets, they have resources, and importantly, they have relationships with those people with a disability, can pass information on and can do it sort of collectively and more effortlessly. So just touching on women, I guess, and we really recognise that women aren't a homogenous group and that they do represent an enormous diversity in cultural background, socioeconomic status, geographic location, sexuality, disability and age. We also know that the predominance of structures like patriarchy typically lead to the subordination of women. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, women's and girls' gender roles can be increasingly amplified particularly given their caregiver roles. And these stretch across multiple spheres, professionally, within homes, and right across communities. So a little bit about emergency management and gender, and I'll just show you those, refer to the pictures on the slide there. So what we have on the left is a typical scene or picture of an emergency service agency, in this case a state emergency service. Strong men, middle-aged, carrying a chainsaw, capable and able. On the right, you can see that there are a number of organisations and agencies that are actually looking to change this profile. Traditional roles and stereotyping have precluded women from participating in emergency service organisations and emergency management more broadly forever. And as many of you may know, it wasn't until the 1980s that women were allowed to become paramedics here in the state of Victoria. I mean, that just seems extraordinary now, but it actually wasn't even that long ago. And we know that the Australian labour market is highly gender segregated by industry and occupation. And this has continued over the past 2 decades, despite the incredible gains that women have made into entering the workforce. In fire and emergency services, women's representation across staff and volunteers sits at just 22%. Women make up only 7% of management in frontline delivery. These operational roles include things like firefighters, which are on a critical pathway to many senior leadership and executive level positions within the sector. And only 10% of current operational executives in fire and emergency services organisations are women. So emergency services itself, or emergency management, is actually a system of top-down control and command that's drawn from military response models. And we all know, military, of course, a very masculine culture, a very masculine way of doing things. And this means, of course, that the planning and preparation for emergencies and then how communities experience emergencies have typically been developed by men and largely for men. We know, of course, that diverse and inclusive workplaces can improve our understanding of the different needs, vulnerabilities, interests, capacities and contributions of people within our communities. And there's been a bit of research that's been done over the past number of years, probably 10 years in the emergency management sector, that shows that incorporating gender considerations into emergency management results in more resilient communities through more effective emergency planning and response. We've still got a really long way to go into ensuring that the skills, experiences and perspectives of women are valued in emergency management, but we are getting there step by step. I want to talk a little bit about gender and the experiences of disaster. There's been a little bit of interest in gender and emergencies since around the 1990s. Some early work by Elaine Inarsson in the United States started to look at the gendered economic impacts of disaster, the loss of assets and entitlement, the increases in women's workloads and caregiving functions, deterioration in working conditions, and women's rather slow economic recovery from losses. Professor Maureen Fordham from the United Kingdom began to explore emergencies and disasters from a feminist perspective also in the 1990s, and she established the International Gender and Disaster Network. More recently in Australia, Deb Parkinson from the Gender and Disaster Pod highlighted the different ways in which men and women experience emergencies following the 2009 Victorian bushfires. In her research, she stated, "Women's experiences are rare in historical accounts. History, after all, is his story. Black Saturday was the worst natural disaster in Australia since colonisation. Its historical significance is clear. Equally clear is the imperative to include women's voices if we understand the experience and impact of the disaster from more than one perspective." And in exploring the experiences of women who went through that terrible time, she says, "There are accounts of women escaping the fires and fighting them. These women speak of courage, persistence and selflessness. In equal measure, they speak of uncertainty, regret and terror. Sadly, some women were silenced by our society's imperative to protect the myth of masculinity. They felt the need to protect the man they loved by not allowing their initial account of his actions to be published. For others, their retraction was due to fear of repercussions from that man." The GADPOD later also researched men's experiences of the same disaster, and it found that men's inability to meet their own and society's expectations of them as men, as protectors and providers during and after emergencies, led to a loss of identity for many men. This was accompanied by fear and a lack of control, and in many instances, this turned into family violence, and for many families, for the very first time. As the COVID-19 emergency made itself known, I began to think of the impacts it would have in Australia and on our communities. And I recall commenting to a colleague, "Oh my God, this is going to impact women beyond belief. This is a completely gendered disaster." And why? Our health system is dominated by women. Our community and social service system is led and staffed by women. Our childcare, disability and aged care systems are dominated by women, as is our education system. Our families are cared for by women. These are all crucial on a day-to-day basis, and even more critical in a pandemic where health and caring is what keeps our communities safe and well. To date, we've been lucky in our response to COVID-19. We've been clever. We haven't seen the thousands of deaths and illness that other countries have, the complete closing down of cities and towns. But if we do, or if we did, systems like the health system, the community and social service system, the system that cares for some of our most vulnerable community members like children, people with a disability and older people, if those start to break down, then we're in real trouble. We know Australia has really low gender equality when it comes to remuneration. We're ranked 49th on the World Economic Forum. And partly this is because women's work is more concentrated in the caring and service industries. It's also more likely to be low paid, casual and part-time. In addition, women do more unpaid domestic work and care compared to many other countries. Most Australian women move in and out of the workforce or limit their paid work hours or career prospects to care for children and other family members. It's this unpaid caring work that supports society. It reproduces and sustains the workforce and saves government from spending much more on public services like aged care and childcare. This cost falls privately on women and their families. One clear indicator is that near retirement, women's superannuation balances are less than half of those as men. And another is that older women are the fastest growing group of homeless in this country. So we're all really acutely aware of the demand of the demand on the health workforce, and the risk that health care workers are facing. And the face of our healthcare response and the risk and hard work inherent in that is a female one. And this means that there's a tension between our need to ensure the health workforce is at peak capacity and the considerations around school closures, childcare closures, because caring for kids and caring for the community comes back for women. The community and social service sector is second only to the health sector in terms of providing support and assistance to communities and vulnerable people in particular, again, both day to day as well as during a pandemic. Our sector plays a pivotal role in delivering human services to a range of community members, many of them highly vulnerable. These services are often delivered in close contact with people, including childcare, aged care, disability services, homelessness services, and a range of other services. The community service sector is highly gendered. It's poorly paid and highly casualised. It faces additional strain due to gendered caring responsibilities. In the event of a protracted pandemic, the potential impact on this workforce, their organisations and their service delivery could be massive. And women are, of course, users of these services as well. With health services overstretched and charities under-resourced, women's sexual and reproductive health services, prenatal, postnatal care, family violence, housing and homelessness, and disability. All of these organisations that are utilised by women for themselves and for their families are under severe strain. Another area of concern, of course, is the impact on casual employees. There are more women than men working in casual employment in Australia with no sick leave. Women are also overrepresented in the industries heavily reliant on casual workers and are being hit hard by the economic downturn. Women make up around 58% of retail workers, but they make up the majority of retail workers in fashion, department stores and furnishings, retail sectors already under strain and most now closed. The combination of insecure employment and exposure to economic shock is hitting women hard. Women bear the impact of closing universities, schools and childcare centres. Again, women are the majority of workers in these settings, almost 58% of university workers, and particularly those in non-management, professional, clerical and community service roles. 72% of those working in schools, and a whopping almost 96% of childcare workers are women. Now, it's not clear whether casual staff are being paid in the shutdown, and we should assume that they're not. They may also not have access to additional payments and benefits. The community service sector, of course, is well aware of the risks and impacts of family violence and the people and communities that we work with. What is less known is the risk of family violence in a disaster context. The stereotypes and expectations of both women and men are heightened during periods of danger, stress, and then over the many months or years that it can take to recover from a disaster. Research shows that domestic violence increases during and after emergencies and disasters. The caring responsibilities of women can inhibit their ability to escape and or protect themselves from harm during an emergency. In addition, men are frequently reluctant to seek help and are sometimes isolated from support services and social networks. It's common for men to self-medicate with drugs or alcohol as a coping mechanism. And although this isn't a cause for violence against women, the use of drugs and alcohol are associated with harmful behaviour to self and others. And in COVID-19, with so many women remaining at the front line in hospital, health, childcare, education and the community sector, many men are becoming primary caregivers. These can become highly volatile situations, particularly if they don't have access to usual supports like grandparents, childcare centres, schools, community members. Being replaced as a breadwinner can be very confronting for a lot of men. Gender experts say that domestic and sexual violence rates rise when societies are under stress, during a natural disaster, food shortages and epidemics, or even when a local football team loses its match. I just want to touch on culturally and linguistically diverse communities in terms of emergencies. And I really like this slide here because it shows two sides really clearly. The first slide shows the strengths of our called communities. It really reflects their inner resources, their life experiences, their sense of community, their gratitude for their opportunities and their beliefs and values. And that's reflected, as you can see, in the funds that they've raised to support bushfire relief in Gippsland. Not only do they contribute to the richness of Australian society, but they contribute to its resilience to emergencies and disasters. The other slide really highlights some of the vulnerabilities that called communities can face when it comes to emergencies and disasters. And some of these vulnerabilities include cultural, economic, social, structural and discursive barriers. Others are access to hazard and risk information, living in unsafe, insecure or low quality housing, no timely or culturally and linguistically relevant information and advice. People from called backgrounds are considerably less aware than others of emergency recovery, emergency communication, and of the opportunity to become involved in either emergency preparedness or recovery committee activities. Disaster resilience initiatives that do engage with called communities tend to focus on a two-pronged approach of disseminating safety information and conducting preparedness training. However, this approach limits learning to a one-way flow of information and ignores the possibility of understanding people's life experiences, cultural beliefs, and importantly, their everyday practices in feeling safe and secure. And like working with people with a disability, person-centred and co-learning approaches work best. There is a person-centred tool that you can see down the bottom here. that encourages person-centred approaches to incorporate a person's whole lived experiences, beliefs and everyday practices for disaster resilience. They build on existing strengths and then identify areas of need and support. In addition, multicultural organisations, migrant, refugee and asylum seeker organisations and others that support called communities must be supported during emergencies to help ensure the needs of their clients are met. And as I touched on earlier with the example of disability organisations, for emergency management systems and organisations to be working with multicultural organisations to help disseminate advice and information, warnings, and then to be able to feed issues as they arise back up into the emergency management system. So what I've tried to do here is give you a little bit of a snapshot of what is really actually a very big and complex space. Emergency management, for those of you who aren't aware, it is a really fascinating policy area. It's very multifaceted and is a real rabbit hole that I have found myself really lucky to go down over the past 10 years. And once I found myself in emergency management, I've never looked back. Look, I'm really keen to take your questions and to hear any of your stories or feedback or insights to help inform the work that we do, as well as help give you some guidance as to where you might find some tools and resources that would be useful for you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bridget, for your presentation. I know what you've shared has really, provided some really great insights into the gender impacts that we need to all consider with COVID-19. So if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to send them through the QA box on the Zoom page. I've got a couple that have already come through, so I might ask them to you, Bridget.
Sure.
So the first one is, do you think COVID-19, no, I think that's already been answered. It was just saying, do you think COVID-19 is going to bring more gender disparity? And I believe that the answer is yes. But the second part is, could we as social workers be trained to help families and communities in this new environment?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, there's a whole bunch of resources available, and I'll just click to the next slide, which will show you some. So first is the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. They have what's called a knowledge hub, which has some fantastic information. There's a whole section on working with called communities, which is absolutely fantastic, and lots of other information too around trauma-informed practice for emergency management, communications for emergency management. It's just a great place to dip into, I guess, and explore what's out there and then what you might consider. The Gender and Disaster Pod, which is an initiative of Women's Health Goulburn North East, Women's Health in the North and Monash University, is also a fantastic resource, and they've produced a number of guides and tools. They have postcards, training courses, and all sorts of things that I'd really recommend that you jump onto their website and take a look. Australian Red Cross, of course, being a really key partner in supporting communities in emergencies right across Australia, also has a number of tools and resources. The great thing with Red Cross too is they're also really keen to work with partner organisations to ensure that the work they're doing is really culturally informed. And then they can actually also support organisations, with basic training around psychological first aid in emergencies and other things. So again, a fantastic resource. Shafali's work from the University of Wollongong, I've given you the name of her toolkit there that is really useful. And I'd encourage you to have a look for that online. It's very easily accessible. And then the last one here I've listed is the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network, bit of a plug, of course, given I'm the president and co-founder. But that's a network for women who work, study, volunteer, have experience, or are just interested in emergencies and disaster resilience. The idea is that we support one another through experience, through learning, through networking opportunities, and it's just a great place to start to get to know people and start to get to know the sector.
Wonderful, thanks, Bridget. Just another question. other kinds of long-term impacts do you think that this pandemic will have on migrant and refugee women?
Unfortunately, some of them I think will be threatened to be really significant. Primarily, I think, will be the economic impact, and certainly for those women that are unable to receive any additional benefits due to the decisions made by the federal government around supporting refugees. So I guess the economic impact is first up. So for those workers that are casual, that have lost their jobs, that aren't eligible for any payments, this could be a really long period of time with no work. That's going to create enormous stress on women and their families and their ability to care for their families. Second is the risk of family violence, and you all know your communities much better than I do, and I'd really encourage you to keep an additional lookout during this time, and if need be, reach out to your family violence providers and experts in your states and territories. Another strain that we're really hearing is around education and educating children. So particularly for women that don't speak English, for women and families that don't have access to the internet or have digital literacy issues, the real strain on those families to ensure that their education for their children continues, and the concerns over that. And particularly, I guess, for those women that come from communities where education is very, very highly rated and highly valued within their cultures, and that this break might be considered to be something really terrible, whereas, me, myself, for my kids, I know it's not going to hurt them too much to miss out on a few weeks of schooling. Another concern, I guess, over the longer term is the health and well-being aspect. So again, there's the physical health and, sexual and reproductive health, as well as, again, psychological well-being. And for women who've come from traumatic backgrounds, whether it's refugee or coming from areas of poverty or other difficult personal circumstances, to have this as an additional stressor in a country that's supposed to be offering them, a bright new future and a fantastic new opportunity, I think will be an incredibly stressful time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bridget. Another question, how can we put called communities at the forefront of policymakers' minds and decisions in crisis and disaster planning moving forward?
Absolutely, fantastic question. So look, there's a couple of ways of doing it. And so one, I guess, is kind of doing the role that I do at VCOS. So, I work at a state level. I work with the state government, with state authorities, and with state level, I guess, emergency services organisations to really advocate for the needs of various communities and cohorts as it relates to emergency management. What you can do at a local level is much more local. So the way emergency management generally works across Australia is that local councils are responsible for local emergency management planning. So if it's a smaller scale emergency, it will actually be managed through your local council. The best way to get called communities at the forefront of thinking is to go to your council and talk to them about it. Let them know who your community members are, what languages they speak, what form of communication they would like. Get a seat at the table on those emergency management planning committees or recovery committees. Just start to make yourselves known. And importantly, ask the questions. Have you considered different ways? Have you considered that not everybody has access to the internet or a computer? Have you considered that we might need printouts and leaflets to impart information and advice? So it is really, it's a collective effort, and in the emergency management sector, we call that shared responsibility. It's sort of a central principle of emergency management, in that, we are as responsible, every person, every community member, every organisation is as responsible for how we manage emergencies as are the emergency management agencies and governments.
Absolutely. Next question. Could you please elaborate on your statement about the one-way flow of information when disseminating information to called communities?
Yeah, so what tends to happen is that an emergency service agency, might get a grant or some funding to do a bit of a project working with called communities or with a particular community in a particular location, and with all the best will in the world, they'll go in and they'll say, right, we're here as the experts to tell you how emergency management is done. This is how it works, and it's all about telling and explaining, mansplaining even, how emergency services works and what you as the called community member need to do. So instead of it, so that's a one-way communication. It's simply, you know, instructing, rather than saying, tell us about your life experiences. You know, oh, you've lived through flood, you've lived through earthquake, you've lived through this. You already have some knowledge and insight. You already understand how to keep your family safe in the event of an emergency. How can we work together to ensure that your plans are relevant in this context? Do you understand the hazards that exist around you here in this country? So very much about working, you know, in collaboration and working collectively. And then, you know, when an emergency is over, for that emergency service agency to be able to take feedback back that says, you know, during this emergency, this called community found that X, Y, Z, you know, the communications were adequate, but this wasn't. The evacuation centre didn't have a separate space for women and children, or whatever it is. So very much a sort of a continual improvement kind of process.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bridget. Next question. What are your thoughts on the impacts on young women, particularly from multicultural backgrounds?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we know that the impacts on young people can be quite severe. And that's partly because of their time of life, if you like. So they're just, you know, they've ended childhood and they're just reaching adulthood. They're getting a taste of independence and freedom. And yet when it comes to an emergency, they're often treated as children. And so they really lose that sense of agency. Another thing that happens with young people is they have this incredible desire to want to contribute and want to support their communities and want to help. But often that help and those offers are disregarded. And that can really set young people back a long way. It leads to mistrust in governments and emergency management agencies and the system, if you like. It leaves them feeling voiceless and frustrated. It makes them turn away from potentially being involved in community-minded activities, if you like. And I really do think that in the case of COVID-19, that the impact on young people really can't be underestimated. I think they've had everything taken away from them, you know, that they so need to be able to socialise with their peers, to go out and be exploring the world, and they're really not able to do that. And I think that's really, really tough.
Absolutely. Next question is, are there any statistics on the occurrence of domestic and family violence during COVID-19?
I think there is some work taking place, certainly here in Victoria. I know there is, and for those of you who are aware, Victoria had a Royal Commission into family violence a few years ago. The government has very much had it in its sights, and family violence sort of as a policy sits now right across all government areas, and it's very kind of front of mind. In that respect, you know, we're lucky, as it were. So I have no doubt that here in Victoria, certainly, those statistics will be being collected and collated. And look, I imagine, you know, individual agencies will. I haven't seen any information come through as yet. A couple of anecdotal things that I have heard is that some numbers to call centres, emergency call centres for family violence have decreased, and family violence sector workers are really worried about this because they think it means that women are living in fear and in fear of picking up the phone, having a man in the house with them all the time.
Absolutely, absolutely. Next question is, without access to internet or virtual classes, children around the world, especially girls, are missing out on their education. So there is a digital gender divide. A recent UN report highlighted girls and women up to 70% don't have access to mobile devices, internet, and digital literacy. How can we address this?
Gosh, that's a really good question. And that's really interesting. It's one of the things that's coming through for us at VCOS. is the issue of digital literacy. And we know that that's an issue in certain cohorts right across Australia, older people in particular, but also people living on very low incomes, people with transient housing, and people with mental health issues in particular. I guess issues around access and literacy are both really prevalent. In terms of a worldwide response, that's not my area of expertise, but we are hearing more and more the need for devices for people to be able to access even basic information, such as we all take for granted around updates on the news. What are the numbers of the virus? Is it going down? What's open? What's closed? And so forth. So I'm sorry I don't have a clear answer for you there. I wish I did.
No problems. Just looking. It's quite a few statements, but I'm not too sure if there's many more questions. So there's a question here. What are your thoughts of promoting consistency across all government departments with regards to funding flexibility, including grassroots organisations in the current environment?
Absolutely, 100%. And look, that's something we definitely know that, you know, during an emergency and post an emergency, that organisations on the ground, including those grassroots organisations, know their clients best, know what's needed, and, you know, are usually incredibly flexible and nimble. And I know pivot's been a word that's been bandied around left, right and centre, and can pivot to really respond to the needs of their clients as they change, as the emergency changes. So one of the things that we advocate for really strongly in an emergency is that those usual expectations around funding must be suspended in the event of an emergency, because the kinds of issues that arise are really different from day to day. So for example, what we're seeing here in Victoria, and I suspect it's probably the same right across Australia, is a really significant issue around emergency relief. So that is the emergency relief sector, so not related to emergency management. So the emergency relief sector being food, material aid, support with paying bills, vouchers, and those sorts of things. So that sector has been under strain for quite some time. It's kind of under a bit of a perfect storm at the moment, because the sector is largely run by volunteers. Between 75 and 80% of volunteers are either stood down at the moment or have stepped down themselves or have significantly reduced their hours to be almost negligible. So that means there's no workforce for that sector, the emergency relief sector. Accompanying that, of course, is a reduction in the level of donations, so material donations, food donations, the closure of op shops, and those op shops are incredibly, those op shops provide income for emergency relief organisations, and even supermarkets and large food supply chains suspending donations of foods and other goods to the emergency relief sector. So that's something where, you know, the sector itself has to try and adapt, and where government has to really recognise that there's been a significant change in the circumstances of those organisations, as well as the demand, and just absolutely must be flexible in both its funding and its reporting requirements as attached to that funding.
Absolutely. Just another question. I'm interested to hear about the impacts on LGBTIQ plus people in terms of access to services and shelters, as well as risks of violence in their households.
Yeah, that's a great question. There has been some research done again here in Victoria by the Gender and Disaster Pod, and again I'd encourage the person that's asked that question and anyone else that's interested to jump on that website and have a look. They released a report into the experiences of LGBTI communities in the context of emergencies, and had some really great insights. No doubt there will be issues with family violence within those communities, but I'm not an expert in that particular area.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Bridget. Another question is, how do we ensure we have equitable access to information during emergencies?
Yep, another great question, and something that I advocate for very strongly. The emergency management system is very slow to change. It's a very multifaceted system. As I said earlier, it involves all three levels of government, as well as emergency services agency. There's different legislation in every different state and territory, different arrangements in every state and territory. So it's not quite a matter of sort of just jumping in and making a really quick change. The other thing, I guess, about equitable access to information is really thinking about, who is the information for and what is its purpose. So, for example, we were exploring the needs of information for called communities at a workshop I was at recently. And somebody brought up the issue of tourists, which is not something we would typically think of when we're thinking about called communities. We tend to think of our own community members, of new arrivals or of refugees and asylum seekers, not necessarily just people visiting. And so, what the levels of information required might be. So it's a terrific question. And again, my advice is to talk to your local emergency management team within your local council, talk to your local CFA, your local SES, and tell them who your community members are. Explain to them what they might need and how that information might be imparted. There is, while government's pretty good at providing translations, I guess, so, you'll jump on a website and there'll be translations in number of the major languages. It's not always recognised that, of course, called communities share information in a lot of different ways, and it might come through community leaders, for example, imams or heads of households. So, and it's word of mouth rather than something printed or something on the internet. So, it's a slow process.
Absolutely. Okay. I think we might stop there, but thank you so much, Bridget, for the presentation today. Really appreciate you sharing this information with us. And thank you to everyone who's asked questions, really appreciate it. I see Bridget's got her contact details. If there's anything that you would like to ask Bridget, please feel free to contact her. And yes, thank you so much again, Bridget.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your interest in emergencies, emergency management and called communities. Please do access those resources, and please feel free to email me. I'm always happy to answer questions.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.